She was a powerful millionaire CEO, wrapped in emerald silk and untouchable pride. He was a quiet janitor, a single father with nothing but calloused hands and a steady heart. When she mocked him in front of hundreds, "If you can dance this waltz, I'll marry you." No one expected him to take her hand. What happened on that ballroom floor shocked the entire city and changed both of their lives forever. The night of the charity ball was meant to be another flawless page in the carefully scripted book of Madison Whitmore's life. She had been preparing for weeks, orchestrating every detail, the color of the tablecloths, the selection of wines, even the way the string quartet would ease from Bach into Strauss when the guests had drunk enough champagne to welcome something. Livelier. For Madison, control was not only habit, it was survival. She had built her empire brick by brick, expectation by expectation, and she refused to allow cracks to show. That was why, when she appeared at the top of the marble staircase draped in her emerald gown, with her blonde hair gleaming under chandeliers and her brown eyes surveying the crowd with detached grace, every head turned. She was meant to be admired, envied, perhaps whispered about, but never mocked. The ballroom pulsed with the hum of wealth and power. Investors clinked glasses, journalists scribbled notes, rivals smiled too broadly while measuring every detail of her presence. At her side, hovering like an uninvited shadow, was Grant Lawson, a man who had orbited her for years with the persistence of a moth circling a flame. He was polished, expensively dressed, and utterly convinced that one day she would tire of her independence and accept him as the inevitable choice. Tonight, his smile was sharper than usual, his eyes glittering with the kind of anticipation Madison recognized too well. The anticipation of a man about to make a spectacle. "Madison," he said loudly enough for half the hall to hear, bowing slightly as though the cameras were on him. "I sometimes wonder if all you need is one perfect dance to complete the illusion. One perfect partner to remind you that even emerald queens are still women at heart." A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. Madison stiffened. It was not the remark itself. It was the tone, the showmanship. She hated being placed at the center of other people's theater. Her lips curved into a smile that looked smooth but carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "An ideal husband," she said clearly, "is a myth. And as for a waltz, it requires someone who knows the rhythm, not someone who only wants the applause." The crowd reacted, some laughing, some whispering, and Grant only spread his arms wider, basking in the attention. "Then let us see who among us is worthy," he challenged. "Let any man here step forward. If he can lead you through a waltz, he will have earned something precious, your recognition. Perhaps even your hand." The laughter grew louder this time, tinged with cruelty. Madison felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest. Grant had turned her into a prize at auction. She could have walked away, could have ended it with a cutting remark, but the pressure of dozens of eyes, the need to maintain unbroken poise, pushed her into a corner. And when Madison Whitmore was cornered, she struck. Her gaze moved past the glittering crowd, past the smirking faces, and landed on the man by the staircase. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, standing beside a janitor's cart with a mop leaning against it. Caleb Turner. He had been sweeping up shards of glass from a tray a waiter had dropped, his expression calm, almost detached, as though none of this spectacle concerned him. His presence was an intrusion in their polished world. Plain work clothes, calloused hands, a man who blended into the background until someone needed the floor spotless again. "You," Madison said suddenly, her voice ringing sharper than she intended. Dozens of heads turned, following her gaze. "If you can dance this waltz, I will marry you." The silence that followed was absolute. Then came the gasps, the shocked laughter, the delighted whispers. Grant froze, his smugness faltering, unable to process the audacity of her declaration. Madison felt the burn of adrenaline flood her veins, half triumph, half dread. She had gone too far, but it was too late to take it back. Caleb straightened slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers across the glittering hall. For a heartbeat, she expected embarrassment, refusal, perhaps a muttered excuse. But he didn't look embarrassed. He didn't even look surprised. He studied her as though weighing not the humiliation, but the need behind her words. And then, calm as stone, he set the mop back into the cart, wiped his hands on a cloth, and stepped forward. "If a lady requires a partner, he said, his voice quiet but carrying through the stunned hall. "Then I have no right to refuse." The crowd erupted in whispers, laughter, and disbelief. Grant's face twisted into something between rage and amusement. Madison's heart thundered in her chest. She had meant to throw Grant off balance to shock the room into silence. But as Caleb crossed the polished floor toward her, each step measured and steady, she realized she had unleashed something entirely different. And for the first time that night, Madison Whitmore, the woman who controlled everything, did not know what would happen next. Caleb Turner had never been a man who sought out attention, and yet now every gaze in the ballroom followed him as he walked forward. The murmurs grew louder, disbelief layered with mockery. To these people, he was invisible until now, just the janitor, the man who swept the marble floors, who fixed a leaking pipe without a word. He knew their eyes were not curious but cruel. They wanted to watch him stumble, to see the joke completed, to laugh at how far beneath them he was. But Caleb carried himself with the same steady rhythm he used when guiding his daughter across the street, the same quiet weight that had kept him moving through years of grief. He neither rushed nor hesitated, he simply moved. Beneath the glare of chandeliers, the memories he had buried began to stir. Once long ago, ballrooms had been his world. He had worn pressed shirts and polished shoes, guiding his wife Hannah across wooden floors with a confidence that had made them invincible in their small circle. They had taught students together, young couples nervous about holding hands, teenagers desperate to master the basics before prom. Caleb had loved the moment when fear dissolved into laughter, when stiff bodies loosened and music took over. He had thought that life would stretch out forever, but forever had ended on a rain-slicked road one autumn night, when a truck's headlights cut across their lane, and Hannah's life was gone in a scream of tearing metal. For weeks after he had tried to keep teaching, he had stood in the studio, music playing, his hand raised for a partner who would never come. His voice cracked when he gave instructions. His chest ached when he tried to demonstrate. Eventually, the students stopped coming. He sold the mirrors, sold the polished shoes, packed away the trophies, and with them packed away the man who had once believed in joy. From then on, he worked where nobody asked him to smile. Factories, warehouses, and finally cleaning the mansion of the woman now standing in the emerald gown, her eyes sharp and unreadable. Yet here he was, walking toward her as though the years between had not happened. Each step brought the old rhythm back into his bones, faint but undeniable. He could almost hear Hannah's voice. 1, 2, 3. "Hold your frame, Caleb. Lead, don't push." His heart thudded, not with fear, but with something like defiance. Madison's gaze locked on him as he reached her. She hadn't expected him to come. She had thrown the words at him like a weapon, expecting retreat. Instead, she saw calm resolve in his eyes, and for a fraction of a second, she faltered. Her hand trembled slightly as he bowed. Not a servant's bow, but the restrained gesture of a man acknowledging an equal. He extended his hand. She hesitated, her pulse quickening. The hall was suffocating with anticipation. Then, with a tiny breath, she placed her hand in his. His grip was steady, firm but not crushing, and something shifted in her chest. She had danced with wealthy men before, men who used the closeness of a waltz as a chance to press their advantage, their desire bleeding into every step. Caleb's touch carried no hunger for conquest. It carried steadiness, as if saying, "You are safe here. Follow me." The orchestra adjusted their instruments nervously, waiting for a cue. Caleb inclined his head slightly, and the conductor, almost amused, raised his baton. The first notes of the waltz rippled through the air. Caleb leaned closer, his voice low enough for only Madison to hear. "Step back on one. Turn your torso, not just your shoulders. And don't forget to breathe." She stiffened, unaccustomed to instruction. But before she could bristle, he guided her into the first step. His arm at her back was solid, his lead clear, and her body, trained to resist, found itself moving anyway. One step, then another. The rhythm pulled at her. By the third step, she realized she had not lost the beat. She was in it. Around them, whispers grew louder. "He'll trip any second. What a spectacle. She's humiliating herself." But Caleb did not seem to hear. His focus was entirely on Madison, on keeping her centered, on smoothing every motion so that the gown swirled like water and her frame remained tall. And Madison, to her astonishment, began to relax. The scent of polished wood and flowers filled her senses. The music rose, sweeping them into a turn, and she let herself be guided. She realized with a shock that she wasn't merely being pulled along. She was being led with skill, with precision, with the hand of someone who knew exactly where the next beat would land. This wasn't fumbling. This wasn't luck. This was mastery. A flush rose in her cheeks, part anger, part exhilaration. Who was this man, this janitor who moved like a professional, who made her heart pound not with humiliation, but with something dangerously close to awe? She tried to look away, but every time their eyes met, she saw only concentration. No trace of arrogance. He wasn't doing this for the crowd. He was doing this because she had asked, and because to him a promise, no matter how sharp, no matter how reckless, was not a thing to dismiss. As they completed another turn, Madison caught a glimpse of Grant's face. His smirk was gone, replaced by a tightness that looked almost like fear. He had wanted a joke, a spectacle, proof that she was untouchable yet ridiculous. Instead, the crowd was leaning forward, captivated. Even the most skeptical had fallen silent, unable to look away from the unexpected elegance unfolding in the center of the hall. Madison's chest rose and fell with quickened breath. Her hand clung tighter to Caleb's, and in that moment, with the orchestra swelling around them and the world reduced to 3 counts repeated endlessly, she realized she had underestimated him entirely. This was no joke. This was a revelation. And somewhere deep inside, a part of her that had been locked away for years began to stir, just as it had in him, with every step he dared to take across that floor. The music grew richer as the waltz progressed, filling every corner of the ballroom, with swelling strings and deep resonant chords. The chandeliers glittered above them like constellations, and for a fleeting moment Madison forgot about the rows of eyes watching, the whispers that had followed her every step. She only felt the steady pull of Caleb's hand guiding her through the turn, the solidity of his arm at her back, the rhythm thrumming through the soles of her shoes. It was disorienting, because she could not remember the last time she had felt so completely led, so certain that she would not falter. She had spent her life leading, commanding, controlling every detail. Yet here, in the middle of her own ballroom, it was a janitor who showed her how to surrender without losing herself. But the crowd did not forget. Their gasps, their muttered commentary swelled with every step. Some expected his foot to catch, for her gown to tangle, for the illusion to collapse. Others, more perceptive, fell quiet, realizing they were witnessing something they could not explain. And at the edge of the room, Grant Lawson's face had twisted from smug amusement into something sharper, something uneasy. His plan to mock her had turned into a spectacle of awe, and he hated it. Madison's lips parted slightly, not for words but for breath. Her pulse was racing, though her movements felt smoother with every measure. Caleb leaned closer, his voice low and calm, never faltering. "Keep your frame," he murmured. "Let the floor carry you. Don't fight the music." His words weren't commands, they were reminders, like someone coaxing a frightened bird into flight. She realized she was no longer stumbling after him, but flowing with him, her emerald gown spreading in perfect arcs as he led her through the rotation. For Caleb, the moment was layered with memory. He could almost see Hannah again, laughing as she corrected his steps, her hands small, but insistent in his. The ache that had lived inside him since that night on the rain-soaked road stirred, sharper now, but instead of crushing him, it poured into the dance. Every movement was not only technique, but devotion, an offering to the music, to the woman before him, to the ghost of the woman who had taught him what grace meant. The orchestra rose into a crescendo, and Caleb guided Madison into a turn more daring than the others, a counter spin that demanded complete trust. For a fraction of a second, she hesitated, then let go of fear. The world blurred around her as the hall spun, her hair loosening from its careful knot, a few strands catching the light like molten gold. When she came back into his frame, her chest heaved, her eyes wide, but her balance unbroken. A murmur of astonishment swept the hall, and then, just as the music softened, the air shifted. A crash rang out near the edge of the room, the unmistakable sound of metal striking marble. A tray had fallen, sending glasses shattering across the floor. Several guests gasped, turning. Madison startled, beginning to twist her head toward the sound, but Caleb reacted instantly. He drew her closer, his body shielding hers, his hand steady at her back. "Don't stop," he whispered firmly. "Eyes on me." And somehow, impossibly, they did not miss a step. He guided her through the distraction as though it were part of the choreography, spinning her away from the spill with precision, so clean that for a heartbeat it looked deliberate. Yet Caleb's eyes, sharp and calculating, had flicked upward. He noticed something no one else had. The chandelier chain above them swayed too much, its fixture glinting with fresh smears of oil. That was no accident. Someone had tampered with it. The tray was a distraction, something meant to draw attention away from the danger above. A cold realization settled into his chest. Madison had not only been mocked tonight, she had been targeted. He pulled her back into frame as the music surged again, his movements seamless, masking the tension gripping his jaw. Madison felt the change in him, the way his grip had tightened slightly, the way his eyes sharpened as though he were not only leading her through a dance, but guiding her away from a storm she couldn't yet see. She wanted to ask, but the music gave her no room, and the crowd's eyes left her no choice but to continue. By the final measures, when the orchestra reached its triumphant close, they ended in perfect form. Madison's hand in his, her gown settling like ripples across water. The hall erupted in applause, the sound like thunder shaking the walls. Guests rose from their seats, some cheering, some whispering frantically, but none able to deny what they had just witnessed. Madison stood breathless, heat in her cheeks, her hand trembling slightly in his. She looked at him, this man she had dismissed as invisible, unimportant, and for a heartbeat she could not find words. The applause rang around them, but between them was silence. The silence of two people who had shared something no one else in the room could understand. Caleb released her hand gently, stepping back just enough to let her reclaim her space. "You asked me to dance," he said quietly, his voice steady but his eyes still wary as they flicked to the chandelier. "I don't break promises." Madison swallowed, still trying to find her voice, her chest rising and falling. For the first time in years, she had no cutting remark, no polished line. She only managed a whisper meant only for him. "Who are you?" "A father," Caleb replied, his gaze steady on hers, "and a man who remembers what it means to hold the rhythm." But even as the crowd clapped and the orchestra rested their bows, his attention flickered back to the ceiling, to the swaying chain, to the fresh smear of oil glinting above the dance floor. He knew what he had seen, and it was not an accident. Something darker had slipped into this night of glitter and champagne, and Madison Whitmore, whether she realized it yet or not, was in danger. The applause lingered, echoing against the gilded walls, but Madison hardly heard it. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, her pulse still tangled in the rhythm of the waltz, and her mind caught between the sharp edge of humiliation avoided and the unsettling steadiness of the man who had saved her from it. She should have been basking in triumph, reclaiming the room with a clever remark, but instead her eyes kept drifting upward, to where the chandelier chain still swayed slightly. Caleb had looked there too, and the intensity in his gaze had not been the relief of a dance completed. It had been vigilance. That realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Guests began to approach, their voices layering like a chorus of contradictions. "Magnificent!" one woman exclaimed, fanning herself. "I had no idea Madison could dance so gracefully." Another whispered, "It was him, did you see?" "The janitor. Where did he learn that?" And then came the sharper voices, those of critics cloaked as friends. "A bold spectacle, yes, but dangerous. Lowering herself that way, it could be remembered poorly." Their words stuck like pins in Madison's skin. She felt the weight of every glance, every muttered remark, and for the first time that night, she was no longer certain she controlled the narrative. Grant Lawson approached, his face still arranged in a smile, but his eyes cold as stone. "Well, that was unexpected," he said smoothly, though his jaw tightened at the edges. "You certainly know how to give your guests a story to tell." He tilted his head at Caleb, dismissing him with a flick of his gaze. "Though perhaps next time, you'll choose a partner with more appropriate credentials." Before Madison could respond, Caleb spoke. His tone was calm even, but beneath it ran a quiet steel. "Credentials don't teach you rhythm, and sometimes rhythm is all that matters." He didn't wait for a reply. He stepped back toward his cart, his place, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. The crowd parted reluctantly, some with smirks, others with looks of awe, but no one dared to stop him. Madison found herself staring after him, frustration and curiosity tangling in her chest. She wanted to call him back, to demand answers, to ask how he had moved like that, why he had steadied her in a moment she hadn't even realized she was falling. But her voice refused to form the words. Instead, she turned to Grant, her mask sliding back into place. "At least one man in this room still knows how to lead," she said lightly, though the bite in her tone was clear. Grant's smile faltered, but before he could retort, a sudden metallic groan echoed from above. Several heads turned upward. Madison's eyes snapped to the chandelier again. The swaying was more pronounced now, and with a sickening lurch, she realized one of the smaller chains had partially come loose. Gasps rippled through the room as a few fragments of plaster fell, shattering on the polished floor. "Get back!" Caleb's voice rang out from the edge of the hall, louder and sharper than she had ever heard it. In the same moment, he was already moving, cutting across the floor with a speed that belied his calm demeanor. He reached Madison just as another groan came from above. Without hesitation, he pulled her firmly into his chest, pivoting to shield her body with his own, as a smaller section of the chandelier's ornamentation crashed down, scattering shards across the floor only feet away from where she had been standing. The room erupted into chaos. Guests screamed, stumbling back, some knocking over chairs in their panic. The orchestra dropped their instruments with a discordant clatter, scrambling for the exits. For a moment, Madison could only hear the pounding of her own heartbeat, her cheek pressed against Caleb's chest, his arm locked firmly around her, as though nothing else in the world mattered but keeping her safe. When the immediate danger passed, he released her, but not fully. His hand lingered at her elbow, steadying her trembling frame. His eyes scanned the ceiling, the debris, the suspicious marks on the chain. "That wasn't wear and tear," he said low enough for only her to hear. "Someone tampered with it." Madison's lips parted, but no sound came. Her world, usually so neatly arranged, so perfectly planned, tilted dangerously. This was no longer about humiliation or reputation. Someone had tried to hurt her. Someone had wanted a public disaster. "Impossible," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Yet even as she said it, the conviction rang hollow. She had made enemies in business, rivals who despised her success, men who resented her authority. But to attack her here, in her own home, in front of her guests, it was audacious in a way that shook her to her core. The crowd surged with noise, questions, accusations, demands for explanations. Grant tried to step forward again, his voice raised. "Ladies and gentlemen, it was nothing more than an accident. Please, let's not give in to hysteria." But his words were drowned out by panicked speculation. Madison could feel the narrative slipping from her hands again. Caleb leaned closer, his voice steady despite the chaos. "You need to check your staff, your security, your guests. Someone planned this. And if they aim to humiliate you tonight, they won't stop here." His eyes met hers, dark and unwavering. "Don't ignore this." Before she could answer, security staff rushed in, guiding guests toward the exits, assuring them everything was under control. But nothing was under control. Madison's chest tightened as she looked at the wreckage on the floor, at the chandelier swaying ominously above. She had spent years believing she could manage every threat with strategy, every crisis with calculation. But tonight had proved something terrifying. There were dangers she could not anticipate, enemies she could not see. And the only person who had seen it before it happened, the only one who had shielded her from the fall, was the man she had mocked in front of everyone. The janitor with the steady hands and the hidden grace. As Caleb disappeared once more toward the edge of the room, blending back into the shadows where no one thought to look, Madison felt a chill ripple through her. For the first time in years, she wasn't just fighting for reputation or pride. She was fighting for her safety, maybe even her life. And she could not deny the truth that unsettled her most of all. The man she had dismissed so easily might be the only one she could trust. The morning after the charity ball, the mansion felt like a battlefield after smoke had cleared. Servants whispered in the hallways. Guests who had stayed overnight left in a rush. And the newspapers delivered to the doorstep screamed with speculation. Chandelier nearly falls. During Whitmore Gala, accident or sabotage. Madison sat at the long oak table in her private dining room. The emerald dress now folded away in a garment bag upstairs, replaced by a tailored navy suit. She sipped coffee, though it did little to steady the unease in her chest. Her staff moved carefully around her, as if afraid to disturb the silence. She could feel the weight of the previous night in every glance, in every forced politeness. Her assistant read aloud from one of the papers. Some sources speculate that the incident was no accident, citing the quick intervention of a staff member. Questions arise as to whether Madison Whitmore has made enemies closer to home than she admits. The words cut deeper than she let show. Madison prided herself on her image. Invulnerable, untouchable. Now, even whispers of sabotage made her seem weak. And the mention of Caleb, the staff member, was a double-edged sword. His presence had saved her, but it also tethered her reputation to someone the world considered beneath her. By noon, the tension escalated. Security stormed into the service wing, flanked by Grant Lawson, who carried himself with smug self-righteousness. They had found something, they said. Something damning. In the janitor's storage closet, tucked in the back of his cart, lay a velvet case containing a brooch encrusted with tourmalines, a piece that had once belonged to Madison's grandmother. Madison froze when she saw it, recognizing it instantly. The implication was clear: theft, betrayal, humiliation. Caleb was summoned. He entered calmly, his sleeves rolled up from morning work, his expression unreadable. Emma, his 6-year-old daughter, trailed behind, clutching the hem of his shirt with her small hand. Madison felt a pang at the sight of the girl, so fragile, so unaware of the storm about to break. "Explain this," one of the guards demanded, snapping the case open to display the jewels. Gas rippled through the room. Madison kept her face composed, though her stomach churned. Caleb's dark eyes swept over the brooch, then rose to meet Madison's gaze. There was no panic in them, no guilt, only disappointment, as though he had expected this kind of trap sooner or later. "That doesn't belong to me," he said simply. His voice was steady, almost too calm. Grant seized the opportunity, stepping forward with mock gravity. "Of course he'll deny it. But how convenient, don't you think? First he manages to steal your spotlight last night, and now this. Clearly he's been playing a long game." His smirk was thinly veiled beneath a mask of concern. "You can't let a man like this linger in your home, Madison, for your own safety." Emma tightened her grip on her father's hand, her eyes wide with fear. "Papa didn't steal anything," she whispered fiercely, her voice trembling. It was the kind of raw, unfiltered loyalty only a child could give, and it silenced the room for a moment. Madison's jaw clenched. She wanted to believe Caleb, but the weight of appearances pressed down on her. Too many witnesses, too many eager to see her stumble. She couldn't allow emotion to cloud judgment, not in front of them. But before she could speak, Caleb turned slightly toward her, his expression unwavering. "Check the cameras," he said. "If you believe this is mine, then check your cameras. Look at who entered that room in the last 3 days." His words carried no plea, no desperation, only certainty. Grant's smile faltered. He opened his mouth, but Madison cut him off, her voice sharp. "Do it." Within the hour, the head of IT arrived with a flash drive. The room darkened as footage appeared on the projection screen. The service corridor came into view, dimly lit, lined with doors, empty. Then at 2 a.m., a figure entered, fumbling with Caleb's cart. The cap shadowed most of his face, but one frame, just one frame, caught him lifting his head. The jawline was unmistakable. The glint of an expensive watch confirmed it. It was Grant. A stunned silence filled the room. Madison turned her gaze on him, her expression unreadable but her eyes burning. "Grant," she said slowly, deliberately, "you have fallen to a depth even I underestimated." Grant's face paled, his mouth opening in protest. "That's absurd. Doctored footage. Surely this is some elaborate—" But his words dissolved under the weight of the evidence. Even the guards shifted uneasily, realizing the narrative had turned. Caleb stood silent throughout, his hand never leaving Emma's shoulder. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. His calm was unshaken, though Madison noticed the faintest flicker in his eyes when Emma squeezed his hand tighter. Relief, perhaps, that her faith in him had not been broken. When the room emptied, when the guards had escorted Grant away, sputtering threats and denials, Madison finally allowed herself to breathe. She looked at Caleb, really looked at him, and for the first time saw not just the man who had caught her in a dance, Not just the janitor she had mocked, but someone who stood against storms with an unshakable stillness she envied. "You knew," she said quietly. "You knew they would come for you." He shrugged, a weary motion. "When you step into the light, someone always tries to drag you back into the shadows. I've learned to expect it." Emma tugged at his shirt again, looking up at him. "Can we go home now, Papa?" Caleb nodded, his voice softening only for her. "Yes, baby girl. We're done here." Madison watched them leave, the image searing itself into her mind. A man walking away from ruin that had nearly consumed him, holding his daughter's small hand, steady and unbroken. And for reasons she couldn't yet name, she felt something shift inside her. An unease that was less about fear and more about the possibility that her carefully controlled world had just collided with a force she couldn't manage. But perhaps desperately needed. The mansion was quieter that evening, but it was not the peaceful quiet Madison usually cultivated. It was the heavy quiet of suspicion and tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. After Grant's disgraceful exposure, the gossip had already spread beyond the estate walls. Whispers painted the image of Madison Whitmore as both a victim and a woman surrounded by betrayal. She sat in her study, the fire in the hearth burning low, the weight of her grandmother's brooch still heavy in her mind. She could not decide which cut deeper, that Grant had dared to sabotage her, or that she had nearly believed Caleb guilty. The memory of Emma's trembling voice, "Papa didn't steal anything," echoed in her ears like a reproach she hadn't earned forgiveness for. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said. Caleb stepped inside, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his posture straight but careful, like a man used to entering rooms where he was not welcome. He closed the door quietly behind him, carrying a folder under his arm. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She studied him, the calm strength in his eyes, the quiet way he carried himself as though he had been shaped by storms and had no time for vanity. "You shouldn't be here," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "If the board finds out I'm meeting privately with you, they'll think—" "They already think what they want," Caleb interrupted gently. He placed the folder on her desk, sliding it toward her. "This matters more than appearances." Madison frowned, flipping it open. Inside were printed emails, photocopies of invoices, and a list of phone numbers scrawled on lined paper. "What is this?" she asked. "Evidence," he said simply. "I've been collecting it for weeks, maybe months if I'm honest. At first I thought I was paranoid. Tools misplaced, supply orders changed, security guards rotated out without notice. Then I started tracking. These," he tapped the papers, "are phone logs to a contractor who serviced your chandelier 2 days before the gala. Same contractor who also handled your alarm systems. And here," he pulled out a photo of a receipt. "They were paid through an account tied to one of Grant's shell companies. Different names, same routing number." Madison's heart pounded as she read, her fingers trembling slightly on the papers. "You were watching him this whole time?" "I wasn't just watching him, I was watching everyone," Caleb said. "You've made enemies, Madison, more than you realize. Men who smile at you in daylight and sharpen knives in the dark. I knew something was coming. I just didn't know when or how. So I started leaving a trail, something I could use when it finally happened." She looked up at him, eyes narrowed. "And what, exactly, were you planning to do with all of this? Blackmail me? Trade it for your safety?" The corner of his mouth tightened, though it wasn't a smile. It was more like pain restrained. "Number I was going to give it to the press, anonymously. I already did once." He hesitated, then added, "Under the name Finch." The word hung in the air between them. Madison tilted her head, confusion flickering. "Finch?" Caleb exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Emma found a finch once, a little bird with a broken wing. She insisted on taking care of it. We both thought it would die, but somehow it lived. It flew crooked, it struggled, but it still flew. She called it her lucky bird. When I needed a name to hide behind, that's the one I used." Finch. Madison stared at him, her throat tight. She had heard of Finch before. An anonymous source whispered about in a few financial circles, someone who had leaked documents that hinted at corruption in the city council months ago. At the time, she had dismissed it as rumor. Now the realization settled in. It had been him all along. "You've risked everything," she whispered. "If Grant had discovered this before—" "He almost did," Caleb admitted. "He was getting close. That's why he tried to frame me. If you'd believed him, if they dragged me out in handcuffs, all of this would have disappeared. That was his plan. He gestured to the papers. Erase me, erase the trail. You'd be left with nothing but questions and broken glass. The fire crackled, the sound sharp in the heavy silence. Madison sank back in her chair, staring at him. For years, she had prided herself on her ability to control every threat, to anticipate every move. Yet here stood a man she had overlooked, a janitor with calloused hands, who had quietly seen the danger long before she had. He had not run from it. He had not tried to use it for gain. He had simply waited for the moment when truth would matter most. Why? She asked finally, her voice cracking despite herself. Why do this for me? You don't owe me anything. Caleb's eyes softened, though his posture remained firm. Because once I failed to act. Hannah, my wife. She needed me to see the danger before it struck, and I didn't. I've lived with that guilt every day since. I can't bring her back, but I can make sure Emma grows up knowing her father doesn't stand by while people burn around him. And last night, when that chandelier moved, I wasn't about to watch someone else fall while I had the chance to stop it. Madison pressed her hand to her mouth, her chest tightening with a mix of grief and gratitude she wasn't prepared to feel. She thought of the countless men in her world who had spoken of loyalty but meant leverage, who had claimed to protect her only to betray her. And here was a man who had nothing, who swept her floors, who lived quietly with his daughter, and yet he had stood between her and disaster without hesitation. The silence stretched, filled only by the fire's glow. Finally, Madison lowered her hand and looked at him with eyes that had lost their hardness. Caleb, you may be the only person in this house I can trust. He said nothing, but the flicker in his gaze told her that he already knew. He had known for a long time. And for the first time in years, Madison Whitmore, millionaire, CEO, untouchable figurehead, felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in decades. Safe. The storm broke quickly after that night, not with thunder but with headlines. By dawn, the story of the chandelier and the brooch had spread across every newspaper and gossip column in the city. Photographs of Madison standing beneath the swaying crystal fixture appeared beside accusations of corruption, betrayal, and sabotage. Grant Lawson's name leaked almost immediately, whispered first in boardrooms, then shouted on the evening news. His lawyers scrambled to spin a narrative of innocence, claiming doctored footage and conspiracy. But the evidence Caleb had collected was damning. The payments, the phone calls, the shadowed footage of him tampering with Caleb's cart, it was too much to dismiss. Madison found herself thrust into the spotlight in a way she had not chosen. For years, she had shaped her image with precision, carefully curating every appearance, every line of dialogue. Now she was forced to confront questions she couldn't deflect with charm. Reporters gathered at the gates of her estate, shouting her name, demanding to know how deep the betrayal ran and whether her empire was unraveling. Investors called hourly, anxious, and suspicious, and some members of her board whispered of stepping down or even forcing her out. She had fought battles before, but never one so personal, never one that threatened to strip her of both her authority and her dignity. In the midst of it all, Caleb remained steady. He did not push himself forward, did not ask for thanks or recognition. He returned to his duties as though the world hadn't changed, polishing the marble floors and checking the locks at night, making sure Emma's laughter still echoed in the quiet corners of the mansion. But Madison saw him differently now. She saw the way he stood between her and chaos, not by force but by presence. Every time she faltered, every time she doubted her own footing, she remembered the steadiness of his hand at her back, guiding her through the waltz when the room had wanted her to fall. One evening, after another exhausting round of phone calls and a board meeting that had nearly dissolved into shouting, Madison stood in the great hall where it had all begun. The floor was empty, the chandeliers fixed and gleaming, but she could still hear the echo of applause, the gasp of the crowd, the crash of plaster. Caleb entered quietly, carrying a small toolbox, checking the repaired fixtures. She turned to him, her shoulders slumping in a rare crack in her armor. "They want me to resign," she admitted. "They think my name is poisoned now, that I can't protect the company from scandal." Caleb set the toolbox down and studied her. "What do you think?" Madison laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. "I think I've built everything on control, And control is the first thing I lost the moment I let someone else set the stage. I hate that they're right. I am vulnerable. And I hate even more that I can't stop it alone. He stepped closer, not invading her space, but grounding it. You're not weak because someone tried to break you, he said quietly. You're strong because you're still standing. But if you keep pretending you don't need anyone, they'll finish what he started. Let them see you're not alone in this fight. Her eyes searched his, and for once she did not see a janitor or an employee or a man out of place in her world. She saw someone who had weathered storms larger than headlines, someone who had walked through loss and still carried himself with dignity. He was not her equal in wealth or power, but in resilience. In the will to survive, he surpassed every man she had ever known. The next day, she walked into the boardroom without armor. No emerald gown, no carefully rehearsed remarks. She stood at the head of the table, her voice calm but unflinching. I won't resign, she told them. I won't hand over my life's work to those who think one scandal erases decades of building. What happened was not a sign of weakness. It was a test of loyalty. And the truth is, some of you failed. But others proved themselves in ways money can't buy. She announced the creation of a new initiative, a fund for staff support, healthcare, and education, born from the chaos that had nearly destroyed her. It wasn't just about appearances. It was about making sure no one who served her house would ever be expendable again. Some of the board members scoffed, others whispered, but a few leaned forward, intrigued, perhaps even impressed. For the first time, Madison stopped fighting to control every perception and instead laid herself bare. That night, as the mansion settled into quiet, she found Caleb in the garden where Emma played among the trimmed hedges. The little girl ran in circles, her laughter bright against the darkening sky. Madison stood beside him, watching, her arms folded, but her expression softer than he had ever seen. You were right, she said finally. I can't keep pretending I don't need anyone. I don't know how to thank you. Caleb didn't look at her immediately. He watched Emma instead, his face lit by the warm glow of a lantern. You don't have to thank me. Just don't go back to pretending you can do it all alone. People like Grant, they thrive on isolation. Don't give them what they want. When he finally turned to her, their eyes met, and for a moment the world shrank to the space between them. Madison felt a weight shift inside her, something loosening in the place where she had carried her loneliness like armor. It frightened her, the thought of letting someone in, but it also made her feel more alive than she had in years. She did not speak of it that night, but as she stood there beside Caleb and listened to Emma's laughter drift into the evening, she realized that her war was no longer just about protecting her empire. It was about protecting the fragile thread of trust that had formed between her and the man she had once humiliated, a trust she now realized she could not live without. The seasons turned, and with them the sharp edges of scandal dulled into memory. A year had passed since the night of the chandelier and the shattered brooch, but its echoes still lived in Madison's world. Grant Lawson was gone, indicted, disgraced, his name dragged through courts and headlines. The company had survived, bruised but intact, and under Madison's leadership it began to shift into something different, something less brittle, less ruthless. She had lost a piece of her invulnerability that night, but in its place she had found something far stronger, humanity, and the courage to let it show. The mansion, once a fortress of marble and silence, had changed too. Where once only the wealthy gathered, now the great hall had been transformed. Caleb had overseen the renovations himself, his hands guiding the workers, his voice steady as he explained the vision. The chandeliers had been restored, the floors refinished, and the walls painted in warm tones. A plaque hung above the entrance. Finch Hall, a place where broken wings can still fly. It had been Madison's idea, but Caleb's words that inspired it. And on the nights when music filled the hall, when children laughed and families gathered, the space pulsed with a life she had never known her home could hold. On one such evening, Madison stood at the edge of the hall, no emerald gown this time, but a simple dress of soft fabric that moved easily when she walked. Her blonde hair fell loose around her shoulders, and her eyes, once guarded, now shone with warmth. She watched Emma twirl across the floor, her small feet in white shoes, her arms stretched wide as she tried to mimic the older students. Caleb knelt to adjust her posture, his hands patient, his smile quiet but full. The sight made Madison's chest tighten, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to joy. When the music softened, she stepped forward, her heels clicking lightly against the floor. Caleb rose, turning to her, and in his eyes she saw the same steadiness that had carried her through every storm of the past year. For a moment she only looked at him, her lips parting as though words were caught behind them. Then finally she spoke. "Do you remember what I said to you that night?" Her voice was low, meant only for him. Caleb's brows furrowed slightly. "Which part?" Her smile curved, tinged with both amusement and shame. "When I told you, if you could dance the waltz, I would marry you." She looked away briefly, her cheeks coloring. "It was cruel, a weapon, not an invitation. I regret it more than I can say." She paused, then turned her gaze back to him, her eyes clear. "But tonight I mean it. If you'll dance it with me again, not for them, not for spectacle, but for us, I'll keep my word." The air between them stilled. For a long moment, Caleb only studied her, his face unreadable. Then he reached out, his hand steady, his voice gentle. "No conditions, no wagers, just a dance." She placed her hand in his, and the orchestra, sensing the moment, began to play. The first notes of the waltz swelled, and they stepped into it together. This time there was no fear in Madison's chest, no weight of eyes burning into her from the crowd. The hall was full of people, but it felt as though only the two of them existed. Her body moved with his effortlessly, her gown flowing around her legs as he led her through each turn. She no longer fought to control the rhythm. She trusted him completely. Emma clapped her hands from the sidelines, her small voice calling, "Papa, spin her again!" Caleb laughed softly and obliged, twirling Madison with a precision that made the crowd gasp and cheer. Madison laughed too, her hair catching the light, her heart soaring with a freedom she had thought long lost. Halfway through the dance, Emma ran forward carrying a small velvet box. She held it high, her eyes shining with excitement. Caleb slowed, catching the beat perfectly as he dropped to one knee before Madison. Gasps rippled through the room, but Madison heard nothing but the sound of her own heart. Caleb opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring, a band of gold with a single stone that glowed in the soft light. His voice, steady as ever, rose above the silence. "No conditions," he said again. "No wagers, no games. Just say yes." Madison's breath caught, tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. For years she had believed tears were weakness, something to hide, but now they felt like release. She laughed even as she cried, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, so there could be no doubt, "Yes." The hall erupted in applause, cheers echoing off the walls. Emma threw her arms around both of them, her little voice shouting, "She said yes! She said yes!" Caleb slipped the ring onto Madison's finger, his hands steady even as his eyes glistened. They rose together, and the orchestra carried them back into the final steps of the waltz. Their last turn was flawless, a perfect circle that ended with Madison in his arms. The world spinning away until there was only the music, only their joined breath, only the certainty that they had finally found something worth holding on to. When the music ended, the applause did not stop, but Madison no longer needed it. She leaned her forehead against Caleb's, closing her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. Not because she had won, not because she had controlled the narrative, but because she had let go, and love had caught her before she could fall. And as the lanterns outside flickered to life, casting a warm glow across the plaque above the hall, Madison knew this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something fragile, something hard-won, and something unbreakable. A love that had grown out of a dare, out of humiliation, out of danger and betrayal, but had survived because neither of them had walked away. The woman who had once believed she needed nothing but control now held the hand of a man who had taught her how to surrender. And in surrender, she had found everything. My personal view on the ending of this story is that it delivers something both surprising and deeply satisfying. It begins with cruelty, with a careless challenge thrown out by a woman who believed herself untouchable and a man who seemed invisible. But as the narrative unfolds, the power dynamic shifts. The janitor, once mocked, becomes the quiet anchor who holds her steady, not only on the dance floor, but in life when her carefully constructed world begins to crack. The finale, where Madison accepts his proposal not out of pride, fear, or spectacle, but from genuine trust and love, feels like the perfect reversal of the beginning. What started as humiliation transforms into redemption. She learns that strength isn't control, it's vulnerability. He proves that dignity and love can survive even in the shadows, and that patience can outlast betrayal. For me, the most moving part is that the story doesn't end with victory over enemies or public approval, but with something more intimate, a choice. Madison chooses to let herself be loved. Caleb chooses to risk his heart again after devastating loss. Emma chooses to trust that her father's world can finally be safe and whole. That is what makes the ending powerful. It reminds us that true triumph isn't wealth or status, but the courage to hold another hand and not let go.